The Manhattan skyline cast long shadows across the rooftop restaurant as Vincent Castellano sat alone at his private table, a glass of aged whiskey in his weathered hand. 10 years had passed since she left him, and he had built an empire from the ashes of that loss. An empire that now controlled half the East Coast, yet nothing filled the void that Elena had left behind. His empire was built on fear, respect, and blood. But blood did not keep a man warm at night. Vincent's security detail positioned themselves at strategic points around the venue, their earpieces crackling with quiet communication. The restaurant belonged to him, as did most things in this city. The chef who prepared his meals worked exclusively for his family. The waiters knew not to ask questions. The world moved according to his will, except for the one thing that mattered most: bringing Eleanor back. The doors to the rooftop opened. Vincent's eyes lifted from his glass, meeting those of the woman who had haunted every moment of the past decade. She was accompanied by a man Vincent recognized as Marcus, one of the city's prominent defense attorneys. Eleanor wore a simple black dress, her dark hair falling past her shoulders, just as he remembered. But there was something different about her, a hardness in her features, a coldness in her gaze that hadn't existed before. His men had brought her here without her knowledge, orchestrating an elaborate meeting under false pretenses. She believed she was attending a charity function. Instead, she found herself face to face with the man she had sworn never to see again. Vincent stood slowly, straightening his tailored Italian suit. His presence alone was enough to make even powerful men tremble. But Eleanor remained motionless, her expression unreadable. "Hello, Elena," Vincent said, his deep voice carrying across the rooftop. His accent still held traces of his Sicilian heritage, refined through years of education and power. "It's been too long." Elena's hands clenched at her sides. Her attorney moved protectively toward her, but she held up a hand, silencing him without words. She had learned through the years how to control rooms, how to project strength. But being this close to Vincent again threatened to undo years of carefully constructed emotional walls. "Get me out of here," she said quietly, but her voice carried a note of finality that Vincent had never heard directed at him before. This was not the frightened woman who had fled New York a decade ago. This was someone entirely different. "I'm not going to hurt you," Vincent said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I simply wanted to talk. Don't I deserve that much, after everything we were to each other?" Elena's laugh was bitter, a sound that cut through the night air like broken glass. "Deserve? You want to talk about what you deserve, Vincent? You, who had me followed. You, who threatened anyone who came near me. You, who built your entire empire on violence and fear." She shook her head. "I owe you nothing, not a word, not a moment, not a glance. You lost that right when you made your choice to continue down that path." Vincent's jaw tightened. His men watched carefully, ready to respond to any command, but he raised a hand, signaling them to stand down. This was his battle to fight alone. "I made that choice for us, Elena, to protect you, to build something that would last." "For your empire," Elena interrupted. "You built an empire, Vincent, not for us, for you. While you were building your power, I was dying inside, waiting for you to come home, terrified every time I turned on the news that I'd see your name connected to another murder, another disappearance." Her voice cracked slightly, the first sign of emotion breaking through her carefully constructed composure. Marcus placed a hand on Elena's shoulder, offering silent support. She took a deep breath, regaining control. "I spent 10 years trying to become someone you couldn't reach, someone you wouldn't want, and it worked. I'm a different person now, Vincent. I'm free. Free." Vincent stood from his chair, moving toward her with the fluid grace of a predator. "Is that what you call it? Living in that cramped apartment in Brooklyn? Working as a paralegal for barely enough to survive? That's freedom to you?" "Elena, I know everything about your life. I have never stopped monitoring me." Elena's eyes flashed with anger. Of course you do. That's who you are. A man who controls everything around him because he's incapable of controlling himself. I was a project, Vincent, a beautiful prize to possess. And when I tried to leave, you couldn't accept that. The words hit Vincent like physical blows. He had expected anger, perhaps some lingering affection. He had not expected her absolute indifference. Over the years, he had imagined countless scenarios of their reunion. She would forgive him. She would see the empire he had built and understand it was all for her. She would fall back into his arms. But Eleanor was looking at him as though he were a stranger, or worse, a criminal, which of course he was. "I have spent 10 years thinking about you," Vincent said, his voice low and dangerous. "Every deal I made, every expansion of my territory, every man I eliminated, I did it all to prove to you that I could build something worth protecting. I wanted to show you that this life, our life, could be more than what it was." Elena shook her head slowly. "You still don't understand. I didn't want more of what you had, Vincent. I wanted you to want something different. I wanted you to choose me over your family business, over your pride, over your need for power. But you never would. And I finally accepted that. So I chose myself. I chose my freedom, my sanity, and my future." She turned toward the exit. "This meeting is over." As Elena and Marcus walked away, Vincent remained motionless, watching the woman who had defined a decade of his life disappear into the shadows. His men waited for instruction, but he remained silent. For the first time in 10 years, the most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast understood what it felt like to be completely powerless. She was right. He had lost her long ago, not on the day she left, but on the day he chose his empire over her. And now she didn't want him back. She didn't want to be saved. She wanted to be left alone. 3 days passed before Vincent could acknowledge what had happened. He remained in his penthouse, barely sleeping, barely eating, unable to conduct the business that usually occupied every waking moment. His underboss, Dante, brought reports that required his attention. Vincent ignored them. The organization ran itself. What he could not run was his own mind, which replayed Elena's words on an endless loop. By the 4th day, Vincent made a decision. He needed to understand who Elena had become. Not through surveillance, though he continued that as well, but through genuine knowledge. He called for his most trusted lieutenant, a man named Salvatore, who handled sensitive intelligence matters. "Tell me everything," Vincent commanded. "And this time, I want more than addresses and work schedules. I want to understand her life. Who are her friends? What does she do in her spare time? What makes her happy?" Salvatore moved carefully, uncertain where his boss's obsession would lead. Over the next weeks, Salvatore compiled files that painted a picture of a woman transformed. Elena had not simply survived her exile from Vincent's world. She had thrived. Her work as a paralegal had led to a partnership in a small law firm that specialized in defending victims of organized crime. The irony was not lost on Vincent. She was, in essence, fighting against everything he represented. But there was more. Elena volunteered at a women's shelter, helping victims escape abusive situations. She had built friendships with colleagues and clients alike. She had traveled to Europe alone, something she would never have dared to do while with Vincent. She had a life of her own, built entirely without him. She had become a woman of principle and strength, unburdened by the weight of his darkness. Vincent read these reports with an emotion he rarely allowed himself: regret. Not regret for the choices he had made. Such regret would require him to believe those choices had been wrong. Rather, regret that his choices had cost him her. He had always believed that losing Eleanor was temporary, that eventually she would understand and return. But reading about her new life, he understood a terrible truth. She had stopped waiting for him long ago. One evening, as Vincent reviewed photographs of Elena leaving her law office, her arm linked with a female colleague's, laughing at something the woman had said, he experienced something unusual. He felt jealousy not of a rival, but of her happiness. She was happy without him. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. That night, Vincent attended a business meeting with representatives from a rival family. Normally, such meetings required his complete attention. They were dangerous dances of power and negotiation, where one misstep could result in death. But his mind was elsewhere, on Elena and the life she had built. This distraction nearly cost him. An assassin had been placed in the room, and it was only through the instinctive reactions of his men that Vincent survived an attempt on his life. After the incident, Dante confronted him directly. "Boss, something is wrong. You're distracted. This is dangerous for all of us. What happened to you?" Vincent looked at his lieutenant, a man who had been loyal for 15 years. "I lost her," he said simply, "and I'm only now understanding what that means." "The woman from the rooftop," Dante said. It was not a question. "Yes, and she was right about everything. I built this empire, Dante. I built it, and I told myself it was for something meaningful, but in building it I lost the only thing that ever mattered." Vincent walked to his window, looking out at the city lights. "She doesn't want me. She doesn't need me, and she's right not to. What could I possibly offer her except more chaos, more danger, more of the same life she escaped?" Weeks turned into months. Vincent maintained his control over his organization, but did so with a new sense of futility. The power he wielded felt hollow. The respect he commanded felt empty, and somewhere in the city below, Elena lived a life that had no room for him. Then came the night that changed everything. Vincent was working late in his office when news reached him of an incident at the women's shelter where Elena volunteered. A man had shown up, a man from Elena's past, someone she had helped escape domestic violence years earlier. He had tracked her down, seeking to drag her back into his destructive world. When she refused, he had attacked her. The details came through his intelligence network before they reached the police. Elena had been injured, nothing life-threatening, but enough to require hospitalization. She was at Mercy Hospital, being treated for lacerations and a fractured arm. Vincent moved immediately, his mind clear for the first time in months. He did not think about the legality or morality of what he was about to do. He did not think about the empire or the organization. He thought only of Elena and the fact that she needed help. Within the hour, Vincent arrived at the hospital. His men secured the floor, quietly convincing security to allow him access. He found Eleanor in a private room, her arm in a cast, her face bearing the marks of violence. When she saw him, her expression transformed, not with happiness or relief, but with something closer to resignation. "Go away," she said, her voice hoarse from medication and pain. Vincent pulled a chair close to her bed. "The man who did this to you, his name is David Hartley. He's 43 years old, has a history of domestic violence dating back 15 years, and he has a pattern of finding his victims after they've tried to leave him." Vincent spoke with the same clinical detachment he used in business meetings. "He was released early from prison 6 months ago due to a bureaucratic error. He's been tracking you for the past 4 months. Elena stared at him. "How do you know this?" "Because I have people who know these things, and because I have never stopped watching over you no matter how much you didn't want me to." Vincent leaned forward. "But I'm going to tell you something else, Elena. I'm not going to hurt him." "Then why are you telling me this?" Elena asked, confusion crossing her face. "Because you need to know that justice can be served without me being involved. I've already contacted the FBI. I've provided them with evidence of his probation violations, evidence of his attempt to locate you, evidence of his violence tonight. They're picking him up now. He'll go back to prison, and this time he won't have the opportunity to track you again." Elena's eyes filled with tears, not of gratitude, but of something more complicated. "Why?" "Because you were right. About everything. I told myself for 10 years that I built my empire for you, but I built it because I couldn't imagine being anyone other than who I am. I couldn't imagine letting go of power, of control, but you did let go. You became someone better. And I realize now that the most dangerous thing I could do is try to drag you back into my world. Then why are you here? Eleanor asked, her voice breaking. Because even though I can't be part of your life, I can make sure your life is safe. I can make sure that men like David Hartley never have the opportunity to hurt you again. And I will, Elena. Not out of possession, but out of, I suppose the only honest word is love. The real kind. The kind that wants you to be happy, even if that happiness has nothing to do with me. 3 months had passed since Elena left the hospital. 3 months of profound silence that spoke louder than any words could have. Vincent did not contact her, did not arrange elaborate meetings or manufacture chance encounters at restaurants, galleries, or charity functions. The most powerful mafia boss in New York had finally learned the hardest lesson of his life. Sometimes the greatest act of love was stepping back entirely, honoring someone's freedom, even when every primal instinct screamed at him to reach out and pull her back into his orbit. But he watched. Not with the obsessive surveillance of before, the kind that tracked her every movement and documented her relationships with surgical precision. Instead, his watching was gentler, more distant, filtered through reports that he now requested less frequently. He knew she had returned to her law practice with renewed vigor, that she was taking on increasingly complex cases, defending victims of organized crime, a particular irony that did not escape him. He knew she had mentored a young paralegal named Sophie, who reminded him painfully of how Eleanor must have been 10 years ago. Ambitious, idealistic, hopeful, untouched by the weight of his world. He knew she had attended a conference in Boston, that she had dinner with colleagues at restaurants he no longer owned, that she had started volunteering at a women's shelter on weekends despite her demanding caseload. He knew she had laughed at something a fellow attorney said during a meeting, a real laugh, genuine and unburdened. He knew these things and did nothing, because doing nothing had become his greatest act of devotion. What Vincent could not know, could not possibly have imagined, was that Elena had spent those same 3 months thinking about him. It wasn't a sudden realization born from a single moment or conversation. Instead, it came in fragments, accumulating like snow in winter until she found herself buried beneath the weight of an inescapable truth. She missed him. Not the possessive, dangerous man who had held her captive in his world of luxury and fear, the man who had made her feel like a precious possession, to be guarded and controlled. She missed the man who had held her hand in that sterile hospital room with its fluorescent lights and beeping machines, and promised not to destroy the man who hurt her. She missed the man who had finally, after all those years, understood what love actually meant. She missed the man who had learned that love without freedom was just another form of prison. Her colleague Maria had noticed the distraction weeks ago. She caught Elena staring out their office window for the 3rd time in a single day, her legal documents forgotten on the desk, her coffee growing cold beside her laptop. They had worked together for 2 years, and Maria was one of the few people who knew fragments of Elena's past, though never the complete story, never the truth about the man who had shaped her, marked her, and ultimately set her free. "You've got it bad," Maria said one Thursday afternoon, sitting casually on the edge of Elena's desk. She was a woman in her 50s, divorced twice, and possessed the kind of clarity that came from having lived through her own versions of complicated love. "And don't tell me I'm wrong, because I've seen this look before. I wore this look myself back in 2008 when I was deciding whether to give my second husband another chance." "I don't know what you mean," Elena said carefully, not turning from the window where the Manhattan skyline stretched toward an indifferent sky, its buildings rising like monuments to human ambition and desire. "That look. That's the expression of someone who's figured something out and isn't remotely sure what to do about it. It's the look of someone weighing the risks and rewards of a decision that could change everything. Maria smiled knowingly, the kind of smile that came from hard-won experience. So either you're going back to school, planning to quit your job, or it's someone. My money's on someone. Elena finally turned from the window and looked at her friend. How could she possibly explain to Maria, a woman who had built her entire career on helping victims escape dangerous men, that she was seriously considering walking back toward the most dangerous man she'd ever known? How could she articulate that the danger had transformed into something entirely different? Not safety exactly, but something far more nuanced and complex. Trust, perhaps. Or maybe the belief that someone could change not in grand, theatrical ways that would make for compelling Hollywood narratives, but in the quiet, persistent, unsexy work of becoming better than you'd been yesterday. It's complicated, Elena finally said, which was both the most honest and most evasive answer she could possibly give. The best loves usually are, Maria replied, squeezing her shoulder before returning to her own desk, content with the knowledge that Eleanor would share more when she was ready. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her small Brooklyn apartment, surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of her independent life. There were books on psychology, criminology, the psychology of criminals, narratives of redemption, and self-help texts about healing from toxic relationships. She had tried to understand Vincent through research and intellectual analysis, as though the answer to their impossible situation could be discovered in case studies, statistical analyses, and theoretical frameworks developed by academics who had never met him, never felt the intensity of his presence, never experienced the contradictions of loving someone who was capable of both extraordinary cruelty and genuine tenderness. But understanding wasn't what she needed. Understanding was something she had already achieved through years of therapy and painful self-reflection. What she needed was to decide if she was brave enough, strong enough, wise enough to try again. What she needed was to decide if the man who had let her go was someone worth coming back to. The next morning, Eleanor began to move toward him. It started small, these tiny breadcrumbs of intention. She allowed herself to walk past the building where his office was located, telling herself with unconvincing rationality that it was just coincidence, that she was simply in the area for other reasons. She attended a charity function she knew he would attend, a gala benefiting children's literacy, and when she felt his eyes find her across the crowded room, that familiar electric sensation of being seen by him, she didn't leave. She didn't hide. She met his gaze for a long moment before turning away, leaving him wondering if the connection had been real or imagined. She ordered coffee from the cafe he sometimes frequented in the mornings, the same cafe where a barista with kind eyes remembered her order. When the barista mentioned one day that the tall, dark-haired man with the serious expression had paid for her drink, Elena didn't refuse the gesture or inquire about who had paid. She simply accepted it as a communication, a word written in the language only they understood. These were breadcrumbs, small gestures in a complicated dialogue written in the spaces between intention and action. Vincent recognized them immediately because he had spent a decade learning to read every nuance of her presence, every shift in her expression, every subtle way her body moved through space. He understood what she was doing, what these small encounters meant, and he waited because he had learned that patience was perhaps the greatest gift he could offer her, greater than roses, greater than romantic declarations, greater than any material possession or promise of protection. It took 3 weeks of these small encounters before Eleanor had the courage to go to his penthouse. She stood outside his building for a full hour, her hands shaking despite the relative warmth of the autumn evening. This was insane. This was dangerous. This was asking for heartbreak from the man who had perfected the art of control over decades of crime and power. But Elena had learned something fundamental during her decade of freedom. Sometimes the greatest act of courage wasn't running away or staying away. Sometimes true courage was choosing to stay, with full knowledge of what you were choosing, with clear eyes and an honest heart. The elevator ride felt endless, the kind of journey that seemed to stretch time itself. When the doors opened to the penthouse level, Vincent was waiting. He wore no suit tonight, no armor of tailored Italian fashion, just dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that made him look almost human, almost vulnerable, almost like a man instead of a symbol of power. Without the formal dress of his role, he looked vulnerable in a way that broke something open inside Elena's chest. "I wasn't sure you would come," he said quietly, his voice careful, as though he didn't want to startle her with sudden movements or loud noises. "Neither was I," Elena admitted, stepping out of the elevator and closing the distance between them slowly, as though any sudden movement might shatter the fragile moment they had constructed through months of careful distance and careful longing. "I spent 3 months angry at myself for missing you, then another month convincing myself that it was just trauma bonding, that I was romanticizing the idea of a man who hurt me. Then I realized something important." She paused, gathering the words that could change everything, words that carried the weight of years of reflection and hard-won wisdom. "I realized that you actually did change, not because I demanded it, or because you were trying to win me back, or because you were performing some grand gesture for my benefit. You changed because you finally understood that the most powerful thing you could do was let me go. And that realization terrified me because it meant I couldn't hate you anymore. I couldn't maintain the narrative that you were simply a bad man who didn't deserve me." Vincent's hands remained at his sides, though she could see them clenching and unclenching in an unconscious gesture of restraint. "I don't deserve—" "Stop," Elena said, and her voice carried an authority she had developed over years of standing in courtrooms, defending people society had abandoned, demanding justice for those the system had failed. "Stop asking permission to hope. Stop punishing yourself for the man you were. That's not what this is about. This isn't about redemption or forgiveness or any of those grand narrative arcs we tell ourselves to make sense of complicated things. This is about 2 broken people who hurt each other, who walked away, who changed separately in isolation, and who are now asking a single question. Can we try again, knowing everything we know, having learned everything we've learned?" "What's the answer?" Vincent asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as though he was afraid to speak the question too loudly, lest it shatter the fragile moment. "I don't know yet," Elena said honestly. "But I want to find out. Not as the man who possessed me and the woman who belonged to him. Not as the Mafia boss and the victim trying desperately to escape his world. I want to find out as 2 equals who choose each other every single day with full awareness of who we are and what we're capable of becoming. I want to know if we can build something real instead of something based on possession or fear or need." When Vincent reached for her hand, it was with the gentleness of a man who had learned through painful experience that power was not about force or control, but about respect and boundaries. Eleanor allowed him to pull her closer, and when they embraced, it was completely different from every previous embrace they had shared. There was no desperation, no possession, no frantic sense that they were trying to merge into a single entity, or that this moment would disappear if they didn't hold on hard enough. Instead, there was the tentative, fragile beginning of something new, something real, something built on honesty instead of illusion. "I'm going to hurt you again," Vincent said into her hair, speaking a truth he could no longer deny or hide from. "Not intentionally, not because I want to, or because I'm trying to reclaim some sense of control, but because I'm still flawed and broken and marked by years of living in darkness, because I'm still a man capable of violence and cruelty, even if I'm trying to transform that. I can't promise to be perfect. I can't promise that this will be easy or uncomplicated, or that we won't have moments where we both question why we're doing this. I'm not asking you to be perfect, Elena whispered, her arms wrapped around him, feeling him solid and real and alive beneath her touch. I'm asking you to try, and to accept that I'll try too, and to understand that sometimes trying isn't enough, and sometimes it is. But at least we'll be trying as partners instead of adversaries. At least we'll be choosing this consciously, instead of being swept up in fate or chemistry or the gravitational pull of needing each other. They stood together as the night deepened around them, the city lights of Manhattan glittering like stars beneath their feet, the skyline of a city that had been the stage for their entire complicated history. The Mafia boss held his ex-wife, and she held him back, not desperately, not possessively, but with the quiet strength of someone who had chosen to be there. Two people who had destroyed each other, and then, somehow, had found the courage to rebuild from the rubble of what they'd been. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real, and it was honest, and it was theirs.